Okay, back again for the second part of the bureaucracy lessons. This one focuses on not so much who they are, how they're structured, but what they do. The text and these slides are heavily focused on their regulatory function. But you also have to remember that, and as we are seeing play out in front of our eyes, the federal government also provides direct services, the Army Corps of Engineers, for instance. So there are federal government workers, part of the bureaucracy out there actually doing things. The text focuses on them regulating other people doing things. It can be a significant portion of that is regulating what the private sector does, supervising what the private sector does, inspecting what the private sector does, giving a thumbs up or thumbs down on it. And in some cases also regulating what state and local governments do. As part of that, remember, coercive federalism when it comes to the requirements states have to report and be monitored when they receive millions, billions of dollars from the federal government. So the focus on the slides to come will be on what that entails, what are regulations. Then the next time I come on, it will be talking about the requirements of how they're formed, and then the reaction to them over recent years and decades. Okay, primarily through the use of the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Congress, by an act of law, empowers the executive branch to supervise, regulate, manage a designated aspect of that interstate commerce. And as we've talked about previously, the definition of that over many, many decades grew and grew and grew to the point where they possibly have a hand in just about any economic activity. It's hard to find something that doesn't qualify as interstate or international trade, commerce, etc., particularly in the globalized high-tech economy. So the regulation is created based on that law. And what has evolved over time is the Congress, for political reasons, for just practical reasons, does not necessarily go into, in the law, writing the specifics of the regulation. There is some empowerment of the professionals in the bureaucracy to do so. Currently, you're seeing that playing out in the debate over the last couple of days about the stimulus package. The initial Republican program had a bunch of money being sent to the Treasury Department to dole out to businesses based on the discretion of the Treasury Department. The Democrats were concerned that it was too much flexibility on the part of the Treasury Department. They wanted more restrictions on to what that money could be used for or what it couldn't be used for. So there was tension there in how much latitude to give the executive branch. When we are talking about highly technical, particularly scientific stuff, Congress does tend to give more flexibility to the professionals in the bureaucracy. And that's critical because the court established several decades ago something referred to as the Chevron Deference, which means that when somebody challenges a regulation made by the executive branch, feel like it's unfair, the courts are ordered by this Supreme Court decision to give deference to the executive branch agency, and that they were told to do this. They are the experts, and therefore we will defer to their judgment. So you're generally not going to have a whole lot of success challenging the work of the executive branch department. Where you could potentially succeed is if you could make the case that the Congress gave up too much of their legislative power to the executive branch. That would violate the separation of powers, and you might possibly win there. But just challenging an executive branch regulation because you don't like it, you think it was unfair, the courts are almost always going to, again, defer to the judgment of the professionals in the executive branch. So that is, the core process of a regulation, of what a regulation is. Informing them, the general procedure is the law is passed, Congress is empowered to write regulations. Not Congress, the executive branch. The agency then drafts regulations. They have to publish those draft regulations. There has to be a period of time for public comment on the regulations. There has to be hearings on these regulations. There has to be an opportunity to maybe revisit. There might even be a role for the congressional committee to supervise some of that. And then ultimately, after that is played out, the regulations can be applied. In what you're seeing before your eyes here are some things, particularly when it's coming into this research for therapies or a vaccine related to the coronavirus. A lot of those steps are being allowed in this emergency situation to be skipped. We're moving from experimentation to trial to application of these things pretty quickly, whereas the standard operating procedure would say there has to be this amount of time, this amount of time, this amount of comment time, etc., before you could actually start doing some of these things. But we live in, as you know, quite unusual times. The regulations tend to take, as you'll see on one of these slides, two forms. Either they direct the private sector, whoever is being regulated, to behave in a certain way. And there are consequences if you don't. You don't get the seal of approval, you face some sort of punishment. The other is to use incentives to get people to behave a certain way. Generally speaking, the Democratic Party tends to favor command regulations that require things to be done in a certain way. The Republican Party tends to favor incentivizing certain behaviors. Is that absolute? Does every Republican feel one way and every Democrat the other? No. Does it apply to every single regulatory circumstance? No. But it's a generally accepted stereotype, if you will, of how the two parties approach how to regulate the economy. So, beyond the mere definition of what these are, how they get done, what are some problems that arise? Well, one is that the Congress, for a variety of reasons, let's say the legitimate one, lack of expertise, to perhaps less legitimate one, a desire to avoid responsibility, will instruct the executive branch to provide a regulation with very little guidance, minimal guidance, and then it will be left into the hands of these administrators, who have only marginal influence. They're only marginally influenced by Congress at this point. They are not the professional, they are not the political hires, the partisan hires of the president. They have their own perspective. This is what they know, this is what they believe, so they have their own perspective. And they're going to go to work. And 99 times out of 100, they're going to be very responsible, very professional, but what they see as the purpose of why we're doing this regulation could potentially not be what the Congress had intended, what the people in charge of writing this particular bill had intended. So there can be issues there. Generally speaking, unless you're imposing new regulations on something, the iron triangle would tend to suggest there's going to be a cozy relationship here. So there's not necessarily a whole lot of conflict here, but it can be a potential source of conflict. The biggest one is probably they are oftentimes asked to do amazing things in regulating a massive, complicated economic activity, and they're given minimum resources. They can't, we've talked about this previously in the previous section, they don't necessarily have the pay that they can offer to the top experts. They often just don't have enough people to do the job they're tasked with. Think about after 9/11, the need to be sure biological, nuclear weapons of mass destruction were not being smuggled into the United States. Well, I mean, okay, the Commerce Department is charged with monitoring the inflow of these goods. Is there any way possibly to even think about having enough people to do that, to inspect every box, every container that comes into the United States. Clearly, we've used in the last couple of decades technology to supplement that, but that's just one example of they're oftentimes given impossible loads to accomplish. We're certainly going to see the Health and Human Services Department and their ability to respond to this particular health crisis that we're facing. So lack of resources. It's hard to, in a $4 trillion budget, imagine that's true, but it is. And remember, a hefty portion of that is just a machine spitting out checks to people. And then the final one that you see the slides mentioned is they oftentimes have to break with their routine, and that can be a challenge. Or more frequently, what happens as we become a more regulatory state is that you'll have one side of the government, say the Commerce Department, trying to provide regulation and guidance to encourage economic activity. But then on the other hand, the Environmental Protection Agency is empowered to protect the environment, and their regulations provide impediments to the advancement of area of business, or creates variables that businesses have to deal with. So it is possible that sometime you can have one part of a very large government pushing and a different part of the government pulling in their regulatory functions. So this can cause discontent. And again, everybody tends to love the regulations that help them and hate every other regulation because it feels like they're infringing on their rights or on their nation. But that's the sort of the classic hypocritical American. Now, the response to regulation. Ever since the age of Reagan in the 1980s, the dominant political trend, if not at least in theory, if not in practice, has been to advocate for reducing the amount of regulations, just cutting their sheer number, consolidating them, etc. That was certainly the point of the picture that I showed you, the poster of Ronald Reagan early on. It was what George H.W. Bush generally believed in, and it was even what Bill Clinton believed in as a new, not classically far left liberal Democrat believed. In fact, he appointed his vice president, Al Gore, to be in charge of a commission that was supposed to go through and hack out all the useless regulations, consolidate, make them simpler, etc. George W. Bush followed in that vein. Now, the one provision here is George W. Bush is hard to peg down because you have to remember, with No Child Left Behind, all of a sudden there was this elevation of regulating, telling states you had to test at certain intervals. There was, some flexibility, and Virginia developed what we call the SOLs. New York continued to use something it's referred to for decades as the Regents exam. But that was certainly an exception to that trend from 1981 to, say, 2009 of at least presidents promising deregulation. And then certainly in the 90s, when there was a Republican Congress into the early 2000s, that people were sort of on the same page with that. Now, the economic downturn in 2008, 2009, the Obama administration, not so much. I mean, obviously you see more strings attached to the financial benefit, the creation, Elizabeth Warren's organization, the Consumer Finance Protection Board, the regulations associated with Obamacare. There was a little more, not to the degree of, say, the 1960s into the early 1970s, but more restoration of the classic federal state regulating, either as part of money that it's giving out or just to make the economy fairer, better, etc. Donald Trump came in and has sort of returned to that sort of classic 80s, 90s Republican deregulation to varying degrees of success, whether you like them or not. He has attempted them, and using his power as the president made some significant changes in that regard. We will see now, with all that's going on with the coronavirus, what of that remains, and then certainly we'll see come the fall if he's reelected or not, and that will have a big impact. I don't really know where to classify Joe Biden. Is he, an extension of the sort of moderate to even moderate right Democrats of Bill Clinton's era? Or will he be more amenable to the Obama type of regulation? We'll just have to see, should he even win the presidency. Okay, the last topic is the ability of the elected portions of our government, well, actually all three branches of our government, to control the regulatory power of the bureaucracy. I'll first deal with the president, and these are fairly obvious ones. The leadership of all these regulatory arms of the federal government are appointed by the president. They are in the organizational structure of each of the departments, agencies, etc., the bosses. So the president can apply influence in that regard. One innovation that was brought forth by the Reagan administration was they discovered the letter M in OMB. The Office of Management and Budget had initially been primarily about assembling the budget, but it also has a management function to it, and Reagan established that any regulation before they could be put forward by any part of the federal government had to be first sent to the OMB and receive approval there, very much under the direct supervision of the president. The OMB can also issue management directives to the various regulatory parts of the government. So the M part of OMB has ended up evolving into a pretty substantial way that a president can control the regulatory function of the bureaucracy, probably much more so than appointing the secretary of such and such, or the undersecretary, or the director of this agency or that agency. Of course, the president proposes his budget, and he could potentially starve portions of the executive branch that are regulating in ways that he doesn't approve of by cutting their funding or restricting their funding. Congress. Congress can obviously say yes or no to presidential appointments who are the leadership. So if the president is trying to reverse how the Housing and Urban Development Department has been functioning by appointing a very radical, different thinking leader or leadership, secretaries, undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, the Senate could say no to those appointments and potentially demand more traditional mainstream appointments. Ultimately, they have the final say in the annual budgeting. They also have to periodically authorize the existence of these agencies, etc., including their ability to regulate. They can hold the feet to the fire of the regulators by calling them before congressional committees and putting them on the spot live on CNN, having to justify this regulation or that regulation. There could potentially be, once we get through this coronavirus, some blowback on some of the regulations that perhaps the FDA was doing, etc. It's possible. They can, the authorization law that empowers a particular part of an agency to regulate can be changed. They can take that power away entirely. They can add more definition to what the regulations might be, assuming they can pass anything. The courts that I previously mentioned, because of the Chevron Deference, will tend to, if the agency is indeed operating under the law, basically toss out cases that where somebody's challenging a regulation because they just didn't like it. They went through the process, they participated in the rulemaking, and the rule was done, the regulation was passed, and the Chevron Deference would say we're going to not get into the middle of that fight. Now, as I mentioned also previously, however, if there's some aspect of the power that Congress gave the executive branch that you can justify to 5 justices of the Supreme Court went too far, that the Congress, in terms of giving this power, engaged in unconstitutional behavior, then you can perhaps win. And that in particular refers to a method Congress began using quite consistently in the mid-20th century, and that was to, you Department of such and such, create a regulation. Send us the regulation, and then we'll veto it or accept it. There was a case in 1983 involving what at that time was called Immigration and Naturalization Service. I believe it was INS versus Chandra, where the Congress had done that. They had empowered the INS to create a regulation. The regulation was created, somebody challenged it, somebody was harmed by the regulation. And in that particular regulation, it was, and I forget whether it was the House or the Senate, they had given themselves the opportunity as just one chamber to review regulations and decide whether or not to veto it or not, a legislative veto. Well, the court ruled that was unconstitutional. That particular one was unconstitutional, not only because it was Congress giving up its lawmaking power, but it was also violating bicameralism by only having one house. In the same decision, however, they did set a standard that the Congresses have had to live with ever since, that even if you have both houses involved, you have to be very careful how you specifically write into the law. You pass the regulation, then come back to us later and check with us first. So legislative vetoes have largely been non-existent since that 1983 case. Now, however, in many cases, the regulators, the people that work in these agencies, what people who don't like them refer to as the deep state, are going to be going along doing their business. And if they can keep their little corner of the iron triangle happy and maintain that firm relationship with the interest groups involved and maintain that relationship with congressional committees involved, they're going to be just fine. It's when something gets out of balance, somebody maybe goes a little too far on either of the three corners or any of the three corners, where perhaps what they're doing gets challenged, or if there's extraordinary circumstances like a 9/11 or a coronavirus. So that wraps up the second part of the bureaucracy aspect of the executive branch. It's now concluded. I am recording this on the afternoon of the 24th with still no guidance necessarily as to how we're going to proceed from here. As far as I know, the College Board is still going to be offering this 45-minute online exam. So take this for what it is, combine it with the PowerPoints, absorb it. I'll be providing an opportunity probably sometime soon where you can send in questions, preferably live as opposed to my having to respond to 500 emails. Hang in there and we'll see what happens next.